I didn't have many options. After months of searching for a job, my savings had almost disappeared, and rejection after rejection had drained my hope. When I saw the church's hiring sign for an administrative assistant, I applied without a second thought. I didn't expect to hear back. But 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Pastor James Sullivan. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, tall, confident, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. He had a presence that commanded attention, the kind that made people listen when he spoke. The interview was brief. He asked about my past jobs, my skills, my faith. I answered honestly. I wasn't overly religious, but I respected the church, and I needed this job. When he smiled and said, "Welcome to Grace Community Church, Miss Bennett," relief flooded through me. I had a job. I had no idea what I was walking into. Settling in. The first few weeks were easy. My job mostly involved organizing schedules, answering calls, and keeping things running smoothly in the church office. Pastor James was professional, kind, and incredibly charming. He had a way of making people feel special, of making you believe you were truly seen and valued. I admired him. Maybe a little too much. But admiration wasn't a sin, right? Victoria Sullivan. I met Victoria Sullivan during my second week. She was beautiful, early 40s, elegant, with a grace that made her seem untouchable. There was something distant about her, like she was always watching but never fully present. When she shook my hand, her smile was warm, but her eyes studied me. "I've heard good things about you," she said. I felt a little nervous under her gaze. "I'm happy to be here." She nodded, but something in her expression unsettled me. Like she already knew something I didn't. The pastor's attention. I was in his office one afternoon, typing up a sermon outline, when I felt his eyes on me. "Grace," he said, his voice smooth. I looked up. "Yes, Pastor?" His gaze lingered for a moment, before he smiled. "You don't have to call me that all the time. Just James is fine." I hesitated. "All right. James." The way he smiled at that made my stomach flip. It was the first moment I realized something was different. And it wouldn't be the last. At first, I thought nothing of it. Pastor James was friendly, charismatic, he made everyone feel important. So when he gave me compliments or lingered in conversation a little longer than necessary, I told myself I was imagining things. But then, the little moments started adding up. The compliments. "You're doing an excellent job, Grace," he said one afternoon as I organized donation records in his office. "Thank you, Pastor, James," I corrected myself, still adjusting to calling him by his first name. His smile widened. "You're a fast learner." "That's a good quality." I felt a small warmth at the praise, but then his gaze held mine a second too long. Long enough that my fingers hesitated over the papers in my hands. I looked away, brushing it off. He was just being kind. But it didn't stop there. "You have a gift for bringing warmth into a room," he told me one day. "You're very thoughtful, people notice that," he said another time. "You have a beautiful way of looking at things." It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The softness in his voice, the way he leaned in slightly, as if his words were meant just for me. And the worst part? I liked it. Victoria's watchful eyes. I started noticing Victoria more. Or rather, she started noticing me. At church events, she always seemed nearby, her gaze flickering toward me when she thought I wasn't looking. She never said anything direct, but her eyes told a different story. One evening, as I was leaving work, she stopped me by the front doors. "Grace," she said, her voice light but her expression unreadable. I turned to her. "Yes?" She studied me for a moment before smiling. "You must be working very hard. James has been mentioning you quite a bit lately." My breath caught for a second. "Oh," I said quickly, forcing a small laugh. "I hope it's all good things." Her smile didn't waver. "Of course. And then she left, walking toward her car like she hadn't just unsettled me completely. A touch too familiar. A week later, I was carrying a stack of books into Pastor James's office when I stumbled slightly. I barely had time to react before his hands were on my arms, steadying me. "Careful," he murmured. I let out a breath, my heart racing. "Sorry, I wasn't watching where I was going." He didn't let go immediately. His hands lingered, his thumbs brushing my arms in a way that sent a strange shiver down my spine. When I finally stepped back, his eyes were on me, searching, thoughtful. "Are you all right?" he asked. I nodded too quickly. "Yes, of course." He exhaled, then smiled like nothing had happened. "Good." But something had happened. And I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told myself I was overthinking things. Pastor James was a kind man, a leader, someone who spoke about faith and family with conviction. He had a wife. A reputation. He wouldn't risk that. Would he? But after that moment in his office, something changed. Or maybe I had just started noticing it. Lingering moments. His presence seemed inescapable. Whenever I walked into a room, his eyes would find me first. His glances became more deliberate, his words softer, almost intimate. At meetings, when I sat at my desk, he would stand behind me, watching over my shoulder. He would lean in too closely as he pointed to a document or a schedule. I should have pulled away. I should have told him to stop. But I didn't. Because part of me, a small, shameful part, liked it. The late night call. One evening, just as I was about to sleep, my phone buzzed. Pastor James. My stomach tightened. He had never called me before. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" "Grace," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No, it's okay," I said quickly, sitting up in bed. There was a pause. "I just wanted to check in on you." I frowned. "Check in?" He sighed. "You've been on my mind lately." My heart pounded. "That's kind of you," I said carefully. He let out a soft chuckle. "I don't know if kind is the right word." Silence. I should have ended the call. I should have told him this was inappropriate. But instead, I stayed on the line, gripping my blanket as my pulse raced. "Grace," he murmured. "Do you ever feel like something is just meant to happen?" I swallowed. "Pastor, James," he corrected. "Just James." I closed my eyes. This was dangerous. "I should go," I whispered. Another pause. Then, softly, "Good night, Grace." I ended the call, my hands trembling. What was I doing? Victoria's warning. The next day, Victoria came to the office earlier than usual. She placed a cup of coffee on my desk. "Thought you could use this," she said with a small smile. "Thank you," I said, surprised. She sat across from me, watching me over the rim of her cup. "You know, James is very fond of you." The way she said it made my stomach drop. I started, but she cut me off. "He has a good heart," she continued, stirring her coffee slowly. "But sometimes, he lets himself get too attached." She looked at me then, her expression unreadable. "I'd hate for you to get caught up in something you don't fully understand." My throat tightened. "Mrs. Sullivan, Victoria," she corrected. "Just like James had." I swallowed hard. She smiled again, but there was something behind it. A warning. A test. I had no idea if I had just passed or failed. Victoria's words stayed with me. She hadn't accused me of anything. She hadn't threatened me. But the message was clear, she knew. And yet, nothing changed. If anything, James only became bolder. A private moment. One evening, I stayed late to finish some paperwork. The church was quiet, the halls dimly lit. I was alone, or so I thought. As I stood by the filing cabinet, flipping through documents, I felt him before I saw him. Still working hard? I turned quickly. James stood in the doorway, his gaze steady, unreadable. I just wanted to finish this before tomorrow, I said, my voice softer than I intended. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound made my stomach twist. I watched as he leaned against the desk, watching me. You know, he said slowly, I admire your dedication. Thank you, I murmured, looking away. A beat of silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I think about you, Grace. My breath hitched. I turned back to him, shaking my head slightly. James, this isn't. I know, he interrupted. But he didn't move. I know what I'm supposed to be. A pastor. A husband. A man of faith. He exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. But when I'm around you, none of it feels as clear as it used to. My heart pounded. James, please don't. He stepped closer. Not touching me. Not yet. But close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the weight of everything unsaid. I don't want to lose control, he whispered. I should have run. I should have said something to stop this. Instead, I stood frozen, caught between fear and something else, something dark and dangerous. Something I didn't want to name. Victoria's confrontation. The next morning, Victoria was waiting for me. She didn't say a word at first, just gestured for me to follow her into the empty church sanctuary. The heavy doors closed behind us with an eerie finality. She turned to me, her eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. Tell me the truth, she said quietly. How far has this gone? I swallowed hard. Mrs. Sullivan, Victoria, she corrected. I let out a shaky breath. Nothing has happened. Her lips pressed into a thin line. But it would have. I said nothing. Because we both knew the answer. She let out a slow breath, then took a step closer. Grace, listen to me. You don't want to be the woman who destroys a marriage. The woman people whisper about. The woman who wasn't strong enough to walk away. Tears burned behind my eyes. I never meant for any of this. She studied me, then nodded. Then end it. Before he does something he can't take back. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, she turned and walked away. And just like that, my choice had been made. I had to leave. There was no other way. Victoria had seen the truth long before I was willing to admit it to myself. She had given me a choice, to walk away before I became the reason a marriage shattered, a reputation crumbled, and a man of faith fell. And yet, when I sat at my desk the next morning, staring at my resignation letter, my hands trembled. Why was this so hard? I had done nothing wrong. But if I stayed any longer, I would. James's reaction. I waited until the end of the day. The church office was quiet, and I knew James was in his study. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the door. Come in, his voice called. I stepped inside, holding my letter tightly. When he saw me, he smiled, until his eyes dropped to the paper in my hands. His expression shifted. What's that? I swallowed. My resignation. For the first time, I saw panic flicker across his face. He stood slowly, his hands pressing against the desk. Grace, don't do this. I forced myself to meet his gaze. I have to. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Did Victoria? This isn't about her, I interrupted. This is about me. About what's right. Silence stretched between us. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he asked, Do you think I'm a bad man? I shook my head. No. Because that was the truth. James wasn't a bad man. He was just a weak one. And if I stayed, I would become weak too. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. He wanted to fight this. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out, not to touch me, but to take the resignation letter from my hands. I let him. Because it was over. The goodbye. I packed up my desk that evening, the church halls empty around me. Victoria appeared just as I was about to leave. We stood in silence for a moment before she finally spoke. You made the right choice, she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then, to my surprise, she stepped forward and squeezed my hand. Not in anger. Not in victory. But in understanding. She turned and walked away without another word. And I did the same. The aftermath. I don't know what happened between them after I left. I never stepped foot in that church again. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if James ever thinks about me. If he remembers the moments we never should have had. If he ever almost calls me. And I wonder if I would still pick up. The end.